It was December 1944, the last brutal winter of the war in Europe. The snow fell thick across the Ardennes, muffling the sound of boots, bombs, and the desperate prayers of men who no longer believed in victory. Deep within the pine forests east of Bastogne, Colonel Erich Wexler of the 2nd Panzer Division stood beside a battered Opel truck, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. His gloves were torn. His men were hungry. His tanks were thirsty. Not for blood, for fuel. For months, Wexler had watched the Wehrmacht bleed from every front. The once mighty German war machine, the pride of Blitzkrieg, was now crawling on empty tanks and fading hope. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Trains sat motionless in the rail yards, starved of coal. Even the mighty Tiger tanks had become useless iron coffins, parked and camouflaged beneath snow because their fuel drums were bone dry. But that morning, just before dawn, a strange radio transmission reached his field post, a coded message from a scout patrol. An American fuel depot had been discovered, hidden near a captured crossroads outside St. Vith. 50,000 gallons, the message claimed. Wexler stared at the figures for a long time. 50,000 gallons of American gasoline. Enough to power an entire panzer regiment for days. Enough to drive the offensive forward and maybe, just maybe, reach the Meuse River before Christmas. He had stopped believing in miracles long ago. But this could change everything. At 0700 hours, Wexler gathered his officers around a frozen map spread over a wooden crate. The men were young, barely soldiers anymore, just boys in mismatched uniforms, their faces gaunt from cold and hunger. "Gentlemen," he began, voice low but sharp, "the Americans have what we need most. We take it, or we die trying." They nodded. They all knew the truth. Fuel meant survival. By 0800, a column of armored vehicles rolled out, half-tracks coughing black smoke, tanks rumbling over the ice-crusted road. Above them, the sky was a dull gray sheet, promising more snow. Wexler rode in the lead half-track, his breath fogging the window. As the forest thinned, he could see plumes of smoke in the distance, not from battle, but from the burning barrels of a retreating enemy. The Americans were abandoning posts everywhere, leaving behind food, boots, even trucks, but always torching the fuel before leaving. It was a war of fire and fumes. When the column reached the crossroads near St. Vith, they found the depot almost untouched. Rows of massive fuel drums lined a clearing, black silhouettes against white snow. A single American Jeep lay overturned nearby, its tires still warm, engine ticking softly as it cooled. Wexler stepped out of his vehicle, the wind slicing through his greatcoat. He could smell it instantly, that sharp, sweet odor of gasoline cutting through the frozen air. "Herr Oberst!" one of his men shouted. "It's real!" They left it all. He walked slowly toward the drums, brushing off the snow with his gloved hand. The markings read, U.S. Army, high-octane fuel, property of U.S. government. For the first time in months, Wexler smiled. "Tell the men to bring every truck, every canister we have," he ordered. "Not a drop is to be wasted." They cheered, a sound he hadn't heard since the early days of the war. But as the pumps roared to life and black hoses snaked through the snow, Wexler stood apart from his men, staring at the endless drums. He had fought since Poland in 1939. He'd seen cities burn and empires collapse. Yet nothing unnerved him more than the thought forming quietly in his mind. The Americans could afford to leave this much fuel behind. The Reich could not. He lit another cigarette and looked toward the western horizon. Columns of smoke marked the American lines. Endless, dark, and thick. For every barrel they captured, the Allies had 1,000 more waiting behind them, shipped across an ocean that Germany no longer controlled. Wexler thought of the briefings he'd attended in Berlin months before, the propaganda, the hollow speeches about inevitable victory. They had shown maps, arrows, grand plans, but never once had anyone mentioned fuel. Later that afternoon, as his men finished loading the last trucks, a young lieutenant approached. "Herr Oberst, what shall we do once we've refueled?" "Orders from command are unclear." Wexler hesitated. Then he gave a tired smile. "Orders," he said softly, "are written by men who still think this war can be won." The lieutenant frowned, unsure how to respond. "But you don't think so, sir?" Wexler looked out at the vast forest, the distant echoes of artillery, and the endless white stretching to the horizon. "No," he said finally. "I think we lost the moment we ran out of gasoline." That night, the sky burned red over the Ardennes. Allied planes returned, bombing every visible road and depot. As bombs fell closer, Wexler's men scrambled to protect the captured fuel. Some of the barrels exploded in brilliant yellow fireballs, turning the snow into molten glass. Through the chaos, Wexler climbed onto a half-track and shouted above the noise, "Save what you can! Drive! Head east!" The engines roared. The column fled into the forest, carrying what little they could. When dawn came, only a fraction of the captured fuel remained. The rest was smoke. But that night had changed Wexler forever. He had seen the truth written not in propaganda or strategy, but in oil and fire. He realized then that Germany's defeat wasn't waiting in the future. It had already happened. They were simply too late to notice. And as the last echoes of battle drifted away, Colonel Erich Wexler made a silent vow. If the war was truly lost, he would survive it. Not to serve the Reich, but to remember its mistakes. Because somewhere between the frozen forest and the burning fuel, he had seen the real power of war. It didn't belong to the side with the bravest soldiers. It belonged to the side that could still keep its engines running. By dawn, the captured American fuel depot was nothing but a smoking scar in the snow. The barrels that hadn't exploded were loaded onto trucks and tanks, a convoy of metal ghosts rumbling east through the forests of the Ardennes. At the head of the column sat Colonel Erich Wexler, his hands tight on the cold steering wheel, eyes fixed on the narrow road that wound through endless pine. The fuel they had seized the night before, 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, was their only hope. But even as the engines roared behind him, Wexler felt no triumph, only unease. The radio in his half-track hissed and crackled with static. Messages came and went, fragmented, frantic. Reports of Allied advances in the south, of villages retaken, of German armor crushed beneath artillery barrages. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, was already unraveling. "They said we'd push them back to the Meuse," his driver muttered quietly. "They said the Yanks were weak." Wexler didn't respond. He had heard the same promises from Berlin, speeches drenched in delusion. The truth was simple. Germany was running on fumes. By late 1944, the German war machine was starving for petroleum. Synthetic fuel plants in Leuna and Pulitz were being flattened by Allied bombers. Train convoys carrying oil from Romania had long ceased. Even elite divisions were allotted only a few liters of fuel per day, enough to reposition, never to advance. That was why Hitler's generals had gambled everything on the Ardennes, to seize Allied fuel depots before their own tanks went dry. But as the icy roads froze under the retreating sun, Wexler understood what the planners in Berlin never could. Even when you steal your enemy's fuel, you still fight on borrowed time. The convoy stopped near a small Belgian village, a scattering of houses around a frozen river. Wexler ordered a halt. The men needed rest, the engines needed cooling, and he needed to think. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the snow. Smoke still lingered in the sky behind them, the remains of the depot they had burned to prevent Allied pursuit. "Herr Oberst," a young soldier called out, "there's an American prisoner in the barn." Wexler frowned. "Since when?" "We caught him during the raid." Says he was guarding the fuel depot inside the barn. A single lamp cast a weak glow over the prisoner. A man in his late 20s, wearing a torn U.S. uniform, his hands bound. His face was gaunt, his eyes sharp. Wexler dismissed the guards and approached. "Name?" "Private John Harrow," the American said. "82nd Airborne." Wexler studied him. "You were guarding that fuel?" "Yeah," Harrow replied, voice calm. "Guess you got lucky." Wexler lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the prisoner's face. "You think we were lucky?" "Sure," Harrow said. "You stole 50,000 gallons of gas, but it won't matter." "And why not?" The American leaned forward, eyes steady. "Because while you're driving east with a few trucks, we've got tankers crossing the Atlantic every day. We could fill every road in Europe with gas if we wanted." "You're fighting a country that measures oil in oceans." Colonel Wexler exhaled smoke slowly. That was the moment the weight of it hit him. The truth he'd been refusing to face. The Reich wasn't just losing the war. It was running out of the one thing that made war possible. He crushed the cigarette under his boot and left the barn without another word. Outside, the snow had stopped. The men were laughing quietly around fires, some filling canisters with the captured gasoline, others cleaning their rifles. For a brief moment, it looked like the old days, when Germany still believed it could win. But Wexler saw it differently. He saw soldiers clinging to illusions, warming their hands on flames that wouldn't last till morning. He found his adjutant, Lieutenant Breuer, studying a map near the trucks. "We can reach the Siegfried line by nightfall," Breuer said. "If we ration the fuel—" "No," Wexler interrupted. "We use it all." "Get every vehicle home, sir?" "The war's lost," Wexler said quietly. "We save what men we can. The rest—" He looked at the burning horizon. "The rest belongs to history now." Breuer stared at him, confused. "Berlin says—" "Berlin lies," Wexler snapped. Then his tone softened. "They've been lying for years." That night, Wexler couldn't sleep. He walked among the vehicles, listening to the tick of cooling engines. The air smelled of oil and fear. He thought of his family in Dresden, of the cities reduced to rubble, of the thousands of men frozen in tanks without fuel to move or fight. He realized that wars didn't end when armies surrendered. They ended when the engines stopped turning. And in his heart, he knew. Germany's engines had already gone silent. History would record the Ardennes offensive as Hitler's final strike, a desperate thrust into the heart of Belgium that collapsed under its own weight. But for one colonel in the snow, the real defeat came quietly, not on the battlefield, but in the mind. A moment of recognition too painful to speak aloud, that the dream of conquest had been built on barrels that were now empty. As dawn approached, the convoy prepared to move again. The men were silent. The engines growled weakly in the cold. Wexler climbed aboard his half-track, staring one last time at the dark woods behind them. Somewhere in that forest lay the last traces of German ambition, and the truth he could never tell his superiors. The war had already been decided by logistics, not courage. And no amount of gasoline, stolen or earned, could change that now. By the third day, the Ardennes forest was eerily quiet. The snow lay undisturbed across the broken roads, muffling the dying echoes of artillery. Colonel Erich Wexler's convoy, running low on food and nerves, moved through that silence like ghosts. In the back of each truck sloshed the last barrels of American fuel, the spoils of a raid that no longer felt like victory. The soldiers still called it the miracle find, but Wexler couldn't bring himself to use the word. Miracles belonged to men who still believed. He no longer did. The radio operator, Private Koenig, had been trying all morning to reach headquarters. The transmitter hissed with interference, the voice of distant chaos somewhere between static and despair. "Herr Oberst," Koenig said, twisting the dials, "Berlin is calling. They say it's urgent." Wexler took the receiver, pressed it to his ear, and heard the familiar rasp of General Felt, his superior in the 5th Panzer Army. "Colonel Wexler, you are to hold your position immediately," Felt barked. "Berlin has authorized Operation Eisenfaust. You will redirect your captured fuel toward the counterattack at Malmedy." Wexler frowned. "Malmedy? Sir, the Americans have fortified that sector. We'd be driving straight into their artillery range." "Your orders are not open for discussion," Felt snapped. "We must strike before the Allies reorganize. The Führer himself believes this offensive can still reach the Meuse." There was a long silence. The words hung heavy in the cold air. "Jawohl," Wexler said finally, his tone flat. "Understood." He handed the receiver back to Koenig, then turned away, exhaling hard through his nose. His breath hung like smoke in the air. The Führer still believes. Wexler wasn't sure whether to laugh or curse. By December 21st, 1944, the Ardennes offensive was collapsing faster than Berlin could admit. American reinforcements had poured into the region. Tanks from Patton's Third Army cutting through snow and mud with unstoppable force. But inside German command, a different kind of battle raged, one of pride, politics, and delusion. Hitler refused to retreat. Every officer was expected to obey, no matter how suicidal the order. And for men like Colonel Wexler, obedience had become a slow form of death. He gathered his officers inside a small farmhouse that evening. The oil lamp flickered weakly, illuminating their tired faces. "Berlin wants us to attack Malmedy," Wexler said flatly. The room went still. Lieutenant Brewer spoke first. "Sir, with what?" "We have 40 men who can still fight. Half our trucks are frozen, and the tanks have barely enough fuel to turn their engines." "Then we walk," another officer muttered bitterly. "Just like Stalingrad." A few men chuckled darkly, a laugh that sounded more like resignation than humor. Wexler's eyes drifted over them, these worn soldiers clinging to discipline like a tattered flag. He realized they weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of dying for nothing. "We obey," Wexler said finally. "By conserve what we can. If we find resistance we can't break, we retreat?" Brewer asked. Wexler looked up, meeting his gaze. "Wait, kids, we survive," he said. "That's an order." Later, when the meeting dispersed, Wexler stood alone by the window. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. In the distance, he could see the faint orange glow of artillery along the horizon. He thought of the words, "The Führer still believes." How belief had turned into madness, how strategy had turned into suicide. He remembered 1940 when the tanks rolled through France like thunder. Back then, orders meant progress, and victory felt inevitable. Now, orders felt like sentences. He looked down at his gloved hands, calloused, cracked, and trembling. "How many more men must freeze before Berlin admits it's over?" he whispered. The tragedy of late-war Germany was not merely defeat. It was denial. an empire so obsessed with pride that it ordered men to fight even when the fuel lines were empty, even when the engines had stopped turning. And in that frozen farmhouse, far from Berlin's delusion, one colonel was beginning to understand that survival was no longer about winning the war. It was about escaping the lie. The next morning, a scout returned breathless. "Herr Oberst, we intercepted an American patrol. They're closing in from the south. Tanks, trucks, everything." Wexler grabbed his binoculars and stepped outside. Through the falling snow, he could see them, faint silhouettes of Sherman tanks crawling across the valley. The Americans were coming, and fast. He turned to Brewer. "Destroy anything we can't move." "Load the men. We head north." "And Berlin's orders!" Wexler's jaw tightened. "Berlin isn't here!" As the men rushed to their positions, the first shells began to fall. The ground shook, and snow erupted in white fountains of smoke and dirt. The convoy roared to life, trucks swerving through the narrow roads, tires slipping on the ice. Behind them, the farmhouse exploded into a ball of fire, sending fragments into the sky. Wexler looked back once, not at the flames, but at the barrels of fuel still burning. Each explosion was a reminder of what Germany had lost, not just oil, but reason itself. That day, Wexler disobeyed direct orders for the first time in his military career. He turned north instead of west, leading his men away from Malmedy, away from Berlin's fantasy. He wasn't running from battle. He was running toward truth. And in doing so, he crossed an invisible line, from loyal soldier to reluctant witness. Because sometimes, in the dying light of an empire, the bravest act is not to fight, but to see. The convoy rolled through the foggy Ardennes forest, engines humming low like the sound of distant thunder. Colonel Friedrich Adler sat inside his command half-track, the cold metal of his binoculars pressed against his gloves as he scanned the tree line. Behind him, a column of fuel trucks rumbled slowly, carrying what had become both a blessing and a curse, 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel. For the first time in months, Adler's troops weren't running on fumes. His panzer units, which had been idling helplessly for days, were alive again, roaring with the unmistakable growl of freshly fed engines. But Adler's mind was restless. He knew this victory was only temporary, a spark in a dying fire. At dawn, they reached a small Belgian village, U, a cluster of stone cottages scarred by artillery. The locals had long fled, leaving behind empty homes, broken glass, and a silence so deep it felt unnatural. Adler ordered the men to set up a temporary camp. Refuel the tanks, inspect the vehicles, and rest the drivers. "We move before dusk," he commanded, his voice sharp but tired. Major Klaus Reinhardt, his trusted second-in-command, approached with a hesitant look. "Herr Oberst," he began quietly, "do you realize what we've done? We've captured more fuel in one night than the entire Sixth Army has seen in weeks." Adler nodded slowly. "Yes, and yet it feels like we've stolen from the inevitable." Klaus frowned. "I don't follow." Adler looked out at the horizon, where thin trails of smoke marked distant American positions. "We keep finding scraps of their abundance. Look at their supplies, their trucks, their air support. They are fighting a rich man's war. And we," he gestured toward the empty sky, "we're fighting ghosts." Klaus said nothing. He knew Adler wasn't questioning their courage, but the reality of Germany's collapse, something every officer could sense but dared not speak aloud. As the soldiers refueled the panzers, the smell of gasoline filled the cold morning air. The sight should have been uplifting engines roaring back to life, black smoke puffing like victory signals. But to Adler, it was hollow. He watched as one soldier, barely 20, saluted after filling a Tiger tank. "Herr Oberst, fully loaded and ready for battle." Adler forced a smile and returned the salute. Inside, he felt an ache not from fear, but from the cruel irony that all this fuel, all this energy was being poured into a war that had already slipped beyond saving. That night, around a small fire, Adler sat with his map spread across a wooden crate. The inked lines showed his intended route a strike toward Bastogne, where American forces were reportedly stretched thin. But he hesitated. Every calculation, every route, every move seemed to end the same way: encirclement or annihilation. Germany no longer had air superiority, and their supply lines were shattered. Still, orders from high command were clear: push forward, reach the Meuse. Cut them off. Adler stared at the message long after the fire burned low. "Cut them off," he muttered bitterly, "when it is we who are already cut off from reality." Before dawn, Adler sat inside his half-track reading a crumpled letter, one he'd been carrying for months. It was from his wife, Elena, back in Dresden. "Our son, Wilhelm, asked when you will come home. The city is quiet now. Too quiet. We have little food, but the neighbors share what they can. I still believe you will return not as a soldier, but as a father. Please stay safe." He read it again and again, tracing her handwriting with his finger. The words felt like they were from another world, another lifetime, before the war consumed everything human inside him. He folded the letter and tucked it back into his pocket, just as Klaus entered the vehicle. "Herr Oberst, the men are ready. Shall we move?" Adler nodded. "Yes, but remember, no unnecessary engagements. We're not here to prove valor. We're here to survive." The column moved again, headlights dimmed through a narrow forest road. The morning fog was thick, muffling every sound, but Adler's instinct screamed. Something was wrong. Suddenly, a blinding flash lit up the tree line. The first truck exploded into flames, a direct hit. "Ambush!" American artillery. The convoy scattered into chaos. Shells tore through the forest, igniting fuel drums and turning the mist into sheets of fire. Adler leapt from the half-track, shouting orders. "Take cover! Return fire!" But it was hopeless. The Americans had zeroed in perfectly, as if they'd been waiting for this exact moment. When the shelling stopped, half the fuel trucks were burning wrecks. The ground was soaked in flames that roared like demons. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning fuel and scorched metal. Klaus stumbled toward Adler, coughing. "Herr Oberst, it was an ambush. How could they have known our position?" Adler clenched his jaw. "They didn't need to. We're the only ones desperate enough to move fuel in daylight. They knew someone would come." Hours later, what remained of the convoy limped away, 3 tanks, 2 trucks, and fewer than 50 men. They stopped by a stream to cool the overheated engines. Adler stood beside the wreckage of a tanker truck, watching the last drops of gasoline drip into the water. The stream shimmered with rainbow hues, a beautiful, poisonous reflection of all that was left of the Reich's might. He turned to Klaus. "Do you see it now?" he asked quietly. "This is what our war has become, a fight for fuel, a fight for breath, a fight that ends before it begins." Klaus looked down, his voice trembling. "But we still have orders." "Orders," Adler interrupted. "Orders from men who live in bunkers, who think maps can change what's already written." He looked back at the fading sunlight filtering through the smoke. "Germany hasn't lost because of soldiers or courage. We've lost because we've run out of truth." As night fell, Adler made a decision. He would no longer waste his men's lives chasing empty victories. The Americans could have their roads and rivers. He would focus on survival. The colonel, who had once sworn absolute loyalty to the Reich, now stood in the twilight, facing a silent forest burning with stolen fuel, and whispered to himself, "We captured their gasoline, but they captured the future." The rain fell softly through the canopy as Colonel Friedrich Adler's weary column crawled through the Ardennes. Mud clung to their boots and tank treads, the engines sputtering on the last reserves of captured fuel. The forest was eerily still, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of defeat, waiting to be admitted. After the ambush, Adler's men had lost faith in the campaign. Faces once hardened with resolve were now pale, hollow, and quiet. They hadn't eaten properly in days. Ammunition was low. Fuel was running out again. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done mocking them. By mid-morning, the fog began to thin, revealing strange shapes in the distance tents, supply crates, and parked vehicles. At first, Adler thought it was another American trap. He ordered the men to halt. Major Klaus Reinhardt squinted through his binoculars. "Herr Oberst, it looks deserted. No movement." Adler hesitated. "Keep your weapons ready. We'll approach carefully." As they drew closer, the sight that unfolded before them stopped the entire column in disbelief. The camp was unmistakably American, a forward operations base left behind in a hurry. But unlike the shattered German encampments Adler was used to, this one looked more like a village of abundance. There were neat rows of supply crates, vehicles still loaded with fuel drums, food tins stacked like bricks, and something even more surreal. Machines. Shiny, humming generators, electric mixers. A small metal contraption connected to a freezer unit with a label stenciled on the side. U.S. Army Ice Cream Unit. Adler stared at it, unblinking. Ice cream in a war zone? His men gathered around the strange machine, murmuring in disbelief. One soldier, a young Bavarian named Otto, found an open crate nearby. "Herr Oberst, you must see this." Inside were glass bottles with red labels, each reading Coca-Cola. The soldiers lifted them up as if they'd discovered treasure. The bottles were still sealed, slightly chilled by the forest air. One man popped a cap open with his knife and took a sip. His eyes widened. "It's sweet." "Like nothing I've ever tasted." Another soldier found boxes filled with chocolate bars, chewing gum, and canned fruit. They tore into the packages like starving wolves, but what shocked them most wasn't the food. It was the casual luxury. Klaus held up one of the tins, reading aloud. "Chocolate pudding, U.S. Army ration." He turned to Adler, voice low and shaken. "While we've been boiling roots and bark, they're eating dessert, Herr Oberst." Adler didn't reply. He simply stood there, looking at the scene before him, his men feasting on the spoils of the enemy, the captured trucks loaded with gasoline standing in the background, and that humming ice cream machine still running on generator power. He realized then that the war wasn't just being lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the factories, in the supply lines, in the hearts of men who still had comfort and hope. Later, Adler examined the equipment with a mechanic's curiosity. The ice cream unit had instructions neatly printed in English, something about field morale support. The Americans had actually built machines to keep soldiers happy while fighting. "Morale support," Adler whispered, shaking his head. "We can't even keep our tanks fueled, and they're making ice cream in the forest." Klaus, chewing a piece of gum he'd found, nodded grimly. "It explains everything, doesn't it? This is why they fight so calm. They know they're backed by a country that never runs dry." Adler felt a lump in his throat. "They fight because they can afford to." "We fight because we must." He turned and looked at the bottles of Coca-Cola lined up on a crate, the bubbles rising lazily inside. The sight was almost surreal, like civilization itself had come to mock them in their ruin. He took one bottle, opened it, and took a sip. The fizz burned his tongue, but the sweetness was unlike anything he'd ever known. For a brief moment, it felt like a taste of another world, a world not consumed by war. That night, the men camped there. They lit small fires, ate chocolate, and drank soda under the whispering trees. For the first time in months, they laughed softly, not out of joy, but disbelief. One soldier raised a can of fruit and said, "If this is what they give to ordinary soldiers, imagine how they live back home." Another replied bitterly, "It's not even a fair fight anymore. They have machines for pleasure, we have machines for desperation." Adler listened from his spot by the fire. He said nothing, but the truth weighed on him heavier than his uniform. He thought of the endless propaganda speeches from Berlin, the promises of the 1,000-year Reich. And now here he was, sitting beside an enemy's ice cream machine, realizing that Germany's war had ended long before anyone dared admit it. The next morning, as mist rolled over the camp, Adler's communications officer managed to repair a broken American field radio. Static crackled. Then a clear English voice came through. "Allied troops continue to advance through Belgium. Supply lines remain strong. Morale remains high. Our boys are doing fine. Keep them in your prayers back home." Adler closed his eyes. The man on the radio sounded cheerful, confident, almost relaxed. It wasn't the voice of a soldier trapped in survival. It was the voice of a nation that knew it was winning. He turned to Klaus. "Do you hear that?" Even their voices sound fed. Klaus exhaled. "And ours sound empty." When they finally prepared to leave, Adler gave a quiet order. "Take what food you can carry, leave the rest untouched." "Why not destroy it, Herr Oberst?" Klaus asked. "If we can't keep it, why let them have it?" Adler looked at the camp one last time, the ice cream machine still humming, the Coca-Cola bottles gleaming in the morning light. "Because," he said softly, "it's not the supplies that beat us. It's what they represent." He paused, gazing at the blackened trees around them. "You can burn fuel, but you can't burn a nation's abundance. That's what won this war." And with that, he turned away. Behind him, the camp stood untouched, a quiet testament to the difference between two worlds, one collapsing under scarcity, the other overflowing with plenty. As they marched deeper into the forest, one of the young soldiers whispered, "Herr Oberst, do you think we ever had a chance?" Adler didn't answer. He only looked at the faint American star painted on a truck door and murmured almost to himself, "The moment they brought ice cream to the front, we had already lost." The snow came earlier that winter, thick and cruel. By late December 1944, the forests of the Ardennes had become an endless graveyard of steel. Colonel Friedrich Adler led what remained of his battalion through the ruins of a village called Hallscheid, a once sleepy Belgian hamlet, now reduced to broken stone and ash. They had the American fuel. Yes, but what good was fuel when there was nowhere left to go? Of the 400 men who had begun the campaign, fewer than 100 remained. The rest were gone, lost to airstrikes, frostbite, or despair. Their uniforms hung loose from starvation, their boots wrapped in cloth where the leather had split. The captured American trucks sputtered and groaned through the snow, coughing black smoke like dying beasts. And then came the command handed down from Berlin through a cracked radio transmission. "Hold the line. Reinforcements are coming. Victory is near." Adler read the order twice, then folded the paper into his coat pocket without a word. Reinforcements? He looked around him. There were no reinforcements. Only boys who'd stopped believing in orders. Major Klaus Reinhardt approached quietly. "What did command say, Herr Oberst?" Adler hesitated, the lie heavy on his tongue. They say the counteroffensive continues. We're to hold position until further instruction. Klaus nodded slowly. He didn't believe it, but he didn't challenge it. In the German army of 1944, you learned quickly that truth could kill morale faster than bullets. That night, as the men huddled in the shell of an abandoned church, headlights cut through the snow. A convoy approached black half-tracks bearing the mark of the Schutzstaffel. From the lead vehicle stepped an SS officer, young and sharp as a blade. His name was Hauptsturmführer Erich Vogel, and he carried himself like a man who had never doubted anything in his life. "Colonel Adler," he said, his voice cold and precise. "I am taking temporary command of this sector by order of Obergruppenführer Dietrich. Your unit will reinforce the northern flank by dawn." Adler studied him carefully. Vogel's uniform was immaculate, his eyes bright with fanatic zeal. He had the look of someone who still believed in the speeches broadcast from Berlin, someone untouched by the mud, the hunger, and the truth. "There is no northern flank," Adler replied quietly. "There's barely a front at all." Vogel's expression tightened. "Are you questioning the Führer's orders, Colonel?" Adler didn't answer. He simply turned away and said, "My men are exhausted. They need rest." Vogel stepped closer. "Rest is for the weak. Germany does not rest. Germany endures," Klaus muttered under his breath. "Germany starves." The SS officer's eyes darted toward him, sharp as a knife. "What was that, Major?" Adler cut in. He said nothing. "We'll move at dawn." After Vogel left, Adler sat alone in the church nave, staring at the flickering candle before him. He could still hear the faint hum of the American ice cream machine in his memory, the laughter of his men when they'd tasted something sweet for the first time in months. He thought of the camp they'd left behind, the abundance, the electricity, the food. He thought of America's endless supply ships crossing the Atlantic, while Germany scoured ruins for scraps of oil. The lie that Germany still had a chance was the only thing holding the army together now. Without it, the whole front would collapse. But each time Adler repeated the lie, it cost him a little more of his soul. At dawn, they marched north under Vogel's command. The snow blinded them, the engines froze, and the men moved like ghosts. The forest was thick with silence and the faint smell of burned fuel. Vogel rode ahead, shouting slogans from his half-track. "The Führer believes in us." "The Reich stands eternal." Behind him, Adler walked beside the men who no longer believed in anything. Klaus leaned close and whispered, "Herr Oberst, look at them. They're done. They'd rather freeze than fight." Adler nodded slowly. "And yet we march. Because if we stop, we must face the truth." By mid-afternoon, they stumbled upon another German column retreating from the front. The soldiers looked worse than Adler's mud-covered, eyes hollow, dragging wounded comrades on sleds made of doors. Their commanding officer, a gaunt captain from the 12th Panzer Division, saluted weakly. "Herr Oberst, the Americans have taken Bastogne. They're surrounding us from every side. It's over." Before Adler could reply, Vogel's voice cut through the cold. "You will not speak defeat in my presence. You will fight to the last man." The captain stared at him. "To the last man." "For what, Herr Hauptsturmführer? For a city that's already gone? For fuel we no longer have?" Vogel drew his pistol. "For the fatherland." Adler stepped between them. "Enough. Put it away." For a moment, it seemed Vogel might actually shoot him, but then he lowered his weapon slowly, his jaw tight with fury. "This is why we lose," Vogel hissed. "Cowards and doubters." Adler met his gaze. "Nein, Herr Vogel, we lose because we cannot tell the difference between faith and delusion." The silence that followed was heavy and final. Even Vogel had no words. That night, the two units merged and camped in the woods. Adler walked among the sleeping men, listening to the coughs, the quiet sobbing, the silence of resignation. In the distance, he saw Vogel kneeling before a small Nazi flag he had planted in the snow, his lips moving in prayer. It looked less like devotion and more like desperation. Adler found Klaus by the fire, warming his hands. "What happens when Berlin finally falls?" Klaus asked softly. Adler looked up at the sky, snowflakes drifting through the dark. "It already has. They just haven't told us yet." Klaus chuckled bitterly. "So we keep marching?" Adler nodded. "Until the lie runs out of breath." Before dawn, the radio crackled again. A new message from Berlin. "Victory is assured. Our counteroffensive has crushed the enemy at Bastogne. Hold your ground. The Führer has everything under control." The men listened in silence. They had been near Bastogne. They knew the message was a lie. Adler turned the radio off without comment. He looked at his men, haggard faces, frostbitten hands, uniforms patched with American cloth. He realized the lie had finally lost its power. When dawn came, only half of the men rose to march. The rest simply stayed behind, sitting quietly in the snow, staring into nothing. Adler didn't order them to move. He just walked on, knowing that each step forward was meaningless but necessary. Because in war, sometimes marching into futility is all that's left to do. By late January 1945, the war had turned from a campaign to a slow, freezing retreat. The Ardennes were behind them now, but Germany itself was collapsing. The mighty Western Front, once spoken of with pride, had become nothing more than scattered men trudging east through snow and wreckage. Colonel Friedrich Adler marched in silence, his coat stiff with frost. The American fuel they'd captured weeks ago was nearly gone. The trucks coughed out their last fumes, sputtered, and died one by one along the road like exhausted beasts. And yet Berlin still sent orders. "Hold firm. Reinforcements will arrive. Victory will come." Adler no longer read those words aloud. By dawn, the men reached a small valley outside a burned-out village called Remagen the Rhine, glittering in the distance, a line of smoke stretching across its far bank. They were half-starved, half-frozen. Some soldiers had begun burning books and wooden rifles for heat. Adler stood by the wreck of an American Jeep they'd found on the roadside. The vehicle was riddled with bullet holes, but its interior held something astonishing: medical supplies. Clean bandages, sulfa powder, morphine vials, and tins of food marked U.S. Army Medical Corps. He called out, "Major Klaus, bring the wounded!" Within minutes, men with frostbitten feet and festering wounds were gathered near the Jeep. Adler and Klaus opened the tins, unrolled the sterile bandages, and applied medicine as best they could. For once, the air was filled not with the smell of rot, but of antiseptic, clean and sharp. It was then that Adler noticed movement down the road. Two American medics appeared from behind a shattered barn unarmed, wearing white armbands with red crosses. They raised their hands and approached slowly. Klaus reached for his pistol, but Adler stopped him. "They're medics," he said. "They're not here to fight." The taller of the two men, a young corporal with dirt-streaked cheeks, spoke first. "Colonel, we heard gunfire last night. We've got wounded on both sides. Permission to help your men?" Adler stared at him, stunned. "You'd treat us?" The corporal nodded. "We're medics, sir." Wounds don't wear uniforms. For a long moment, Adler said nothing. Then he stepped aside. "Do what you can." The Americans got to work immediately bandaging German soldiers with the same care they'd shown their own. One of them even handed Adler a small tin cup of hot coffee from a field stove. Adler accepted it silently. his gloved hands trembling slightly as he brought it to his lips. It had been months since he'd tasted anything warm. As the day wore on, the forest filled with the quiet sounds of treatment moans, bandages being unrolled, murmured words of reassurance in 2 languages that didn't need translation. Adler watched the scene with disbelief. In all his years of war, he had seen courage, cruelty, and chaos, but not this. He turned to Klaus, who stood watching the medics work. "Look at them," Adler said, quietly. "They have no fear. They don't ask who we are, they simply help." Klaus frowned. "They're either fools or saints." "Maybe both," Adler replied. He glanced toward the river where smoke still curled upward from the bombed villages. This is what we never understood. While we built walls of hate, they built bridges of humanity." That night, Adler sat by the campfire opposite one of the American medics, a corporal named Jack Morris from Kansas. The man spoke with a steady calm, even while surrounded by his supposed enemies. Morris asked, "You ever think the war would end like this, Colonel? Both sides freezing in the same mud?" Adler shook his head. "We thought we would conquer the world. Now we can't even conquer hunger." Morris poked at the fire. "Back home they say the war's ending soon. Germany's running on fumes. We don't want to kill anymore, we just want to go home." Adler smiled faintly. Home. That's a word that feels foreign now. Morris looked up at him. "Then maybe it's time to stop listening to the people who took it from you." Adler didn't respond, but the words lingered in his mind long after the fire went out. At dawn, they buried 2 dead, 1 American, 1 German side by side near the frozen riverbank. The American medic said a quiet prayer. Adler bowed his head in silence. As the wind swept over the snow, Adler realized something strange. For the first time since the war began, the air didn't smell of oil, blood, or cordite. It smelled clean, empty, like peace. He turned to Klaus and said softly, "Do you smell that?" Klaus sniffed the air. "What?" "Surrender," Adler replied. "That's what surrender smells like." That afternoon, an SS courier arrived on a motorcycle, his uniform spotless, his face young and feverishly devoted. He saluted sharply and handed Adler a sealed message. "By order of the Führer, all officers are to execute or detain enemy medics assisting German forces. Treachery will not be tolerated." Adler read the words slowly. His jaw tightened. Klaus stepped forward. "What will you do, Herr Oberst?" Adler looked across the camp at the Americans tending to the wounded, at the men who were alive only because those medics had shown mercy. He tore the paper in half and dropped it into the snow. "I'll do nothing." "The war is finished, whether Berlin admits it or not," the courier stammered. "But, sir—" Adler turned, his voice firm. "Tell your masters that in this forest the killing ends. If they want blood, let them spill their own." The young man hesitated, then fled back into the trees. That evening, the medics shared one last meal before leaving. They handed out small ration bars and tins of stew to Adler's men. One German soldier, barely 20 years old, looked at the food and whispered, "I never thought the enemy would feed me." Morris smiled faintly. "The war's not between us, son. It's between men who'll never come here to see this mud." When they parted ways, Adler saluted the medics, not as enemies, but as soldiers. As they disappeared down the road, Klaus turned to him and said, "You know they'll call this treason." Adler nodded. "Yes, but someday when the guns are silent, maybe it'll be called something else." "What?" Klaus asked. Adler looked toward the horizon, where the smoke of the Rhine rose like a curtain before a stage's final act. "Wisdom," he said quietly. "Too late, perhaps, but wisdom all the same." The wind outside the camp howled through the broken fences, carrying with it the faint scent of oil, snow, and smoke. Colonel Weber sat by the flickering lantern, his face shadowed and aged beyond his years. The faint roar of Allied bombers could still be heard far off to the west. A sound he had once greeted with dread, now received with numb acceptance. The camp around him, once buzzing with triumphant soldiers boasting of their captured American fuel, had fallen into eerie silence. Most of the men lay in their bunks hollow-eyed, whispering prayers or staring at the ceiling as if expecting death to walk through the door. Weber poured himself a cup of the bitter black coffee, a luxury they had confiscated from the American stockpile. He stared into it, lost in thought. The cup trembled slightly in his hands. "It smells like civilization," he muttered under his breath. He remembered the taste of their own army coffee substitute. Burnt acorns and sawdust boiled in water. "And yet we called them decadent," he said softly, almost to himself. Captain Dieter entered the tent quietly, removing his cap. His expression was pale, tense. "Colonel," he said, "reconnaissance just returned. The Allied convoys, they're everywhere. Fuel trucks, supply jeeps, even mobile kitchens. It's like they're preparing for a festival, not a war," Weber finished with a bitter smile. "Yes, I've seen the same." Dieter hesitated. "Our men are losing faith, sir. Some are saying that if the Americans can afford to make ice cream in the field, then God himself has chosen their side." Weber's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not scold him. Instead, he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Perhaps they're right, Captain. I used to think our discipline, our precision, our ruthlessness would win this war. But I see now, the war was lost long before these fields burned." Outside, a faint commotion began. A group of soldiers gathering near the fuel tanks. Weber stepped out of the tent to see them staring at something in awe. An American generator was running. A young German soldier, barely 20, had figured out how to start it. A metal arm churned, and moments later, cold mist billowed from a makeshift tube. Someone laughed, a strange high-pitched sound that didn't belong to a battlefield. "It's making ice," the boy said, his eyes wide. "American ice. They used it for their drinks." The others gathered around, touching it, tasting it as if it were a miracle. Some laughed. Some cried. Weber felt his chest tighten. He turned to Dieter. This is what they fight for. Comfort, innovation, life. We fight to survive." He watched the frost form on the machine's steel casing, the same frost that clung to their rifles and boots. "Our factories are rubble. Our trains crawl without coal. And yet across the ocean they have factories that produce ice. Ice, Dieter. In the middle of war." Dieter looked down. "Then it's true, Colonel. The Reich is finished." Weber didn't answer. He walked away from the machine, toward the line of fuel tanks they had guarded so fiercely. The barrels gleamed under the moonlight, tens of thousands of gallons that could not save them now. In the distance, faint artillery flashed. The Americans were advancing again. He thought back to the Führer's speeches, promises of glory, of destiny, of invincibility. Now, standing before the spoils of the enemy, Weber felt only exhaustion and betrayal. "They told us we were superior," he murmured, "but superiority without sustainability is suicide." He looked at the barrels again, and then at the thin, hungry faces of his men. "Prepare the trucks," he ordered. "We move before dawn." "Move where, sir?" Dieter asked, uncertain. Weber hesitated. "East, away from the front. Perhaps we can trade this fuel, for food or safety." Dieter nodded slowly. "And if we're caught?" "Then at least we die with the truth in our hearts," Weber said grimly. This fuel is worthless if it only feeds a burning machine. As the night deepened, Weber returned to his tent. He sat down and opened his small leather journal, one of the few personal items he carried since the start of the war. His handwriting was firm, almost mechanical. March 7th, 1945. Near the Rhine. We captured what our Reich has bled for, the fuel of our enemies, yet it feels less like victory and more like revelation. Their abundance mocks our desperation. Their laughter, even under fire, feels like defiance. I see now that power is not measured in tanks or divisions, but in the ability to sustain them. We have none left. Our enemy does not merely fight us, he outlasts us. He stopped writing and looked up. A faint hum filled the camp. Someone had found the Coca-Cola crates. Glass bottles clinked together as soldiers passed them around, curiosity overcoming fear. One of the men, Private Schultz, approached Weber hesitantly, holding a bottle. "Colonel," he said, "the Americans drink this with ice. It's sweet. Would you like to try?" Weber stared at the bottle, at the label, the condensation, the absurd normalcy of it. Then slowly, he took it. He lifted it to his lips and drank. The sweetness hit him like a foreign memory. It was simple, human, almost innocent. He set the bottle down and looked at the young soldier. "Keep it," he said quietly. "You'll need that sweetness more than I will." As Schultz walked away, Weber stood, staring into the night sky, streaked with the faint glow of distant fires and searchlights. The world was changing before his eyes, not with explosions, but with small, undeniable symbols of what endurance truly meant. He whispered to himself, "They can make ice, while we burn." And for the first time, Colonel Weber, the loyal son of the Reich, the conqueror of fuel, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, not for victory, but for the day the madness would end. Dawn came quietly over the Rhineland, the kind of fragile light that feels out of place in war. A thin fog crept through the trees, clinging to the barrels of rifles and the steel bodies of the captured American trucks. Colonel Weber stood atop a small ridge overlooking the valley. Below him, the forested road sloped toward the river, where the faint sound of artillery echoed like thunder. Through his binoculars, he could see them now. American convoys, distant but unmistakable. Their columns moved with mechanical rhythm, precise yet effortless. The glint of sunlight on their tanks looked almost ceremonial. And then, behind them, the horizon shimmered, black plumes rising where Allied bombers struck what remained of German fuel depots. Weber lowered the binoculars slowly. "They've reached Remagen," he said. "The bridge is theirs." Captain Dieter, standing beside him, swallowed hard. "Then this is it, sir. The Rhine has fallen." The words hung in the air like the toll of a bell. Weber didn't respond immediately. His eyes were on the rows of fuel drums behind them, 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel. For days they had guarded it as though it were sacred, but now it was a symbol of futility. The Reich's armies were splintered, retreating, starving for supplies. This fuel could not reach them. The roads were gone. The skies belonged to the enemy. A young soldier ran up, saluting stiffly. "Colonel, we have new orders from Army Command." Weber turned. "Read them." The boy hesitated, then unfolded the message. "All captured enemy supplies are to be destroyed immediately. No retreating unit is to leave fuel vehicles or food for the Allies." Dieter clenched his fists. "They want us to burn it? All of it?" Weber said nothing. He took the message, stared at the stamped eagle and swastika, and crumpled it in his hand. "Burn it?" he repeated softly. "After everything?" He looked out again at the fuel, the lifeblood of modern war, the very thing their own army had bled and died for. He thought of his men's faces the night before, pale, gaunt, but illuminated by wonder as they held bottles of Coca-Cola and ice cubes like precious relics of another world. "They want fire," Weber said finally. "But what if fire no longer serves us?" As the hours passed, tension thickened in the camp like smoke. The officers argued quietly in the command tent. "They'll court-martial us if we disobey," one warned. "This is treason." "Court-martial?" Another laughed bitterly. "By whom? Berlin. There is no Berlin left." "The Führer's still alive. And so is reality," Weber cut in sharply. "Look outside. Does this look like victory to you?" The room went silent. Weber paced slowly, the soles of his boots crunching over mud and gravel. "We've been fighting ghosts. Orders from men who have already lost but refuse to admit it. Burning this fuel will not change the war. It will only feed the delusion that there's still one to fight." Captain Dieter nodded slowly. "Then, what do we do, sir?" Weber's gaze drifted toward the south, where the Allied columns were closing in. "We use it," he said finally, "but not for destruction." By afternoon, the camp was alive with motion. The captured American trucks were lined up, their engines fueled and humming. German soldiers, exhausted, underfed, and hollow, now worked with grim purpose. They were not preparing for battle. They were preparing for survival. Weber stood atop a fuel barrel, addressing them. "Men, I know what they've told you. They say to fight to the last bullet, the last drop, the last man. But I ask you, who benefits when all is burned?" He paused. His voice was steady, measured, not as a commander now, but as a man. "I have seen the enemy's abundance. Their ice, their food, their music. They fight not because they must, but because they can. We are not cowards for surviving. We are not traitors for refusing to die in vain." A murmur spread through the ranks. Some nodded. Others looked away, ashamed, torn between fear and relief. "We will not destroy this fuel," Weber continued. "We will not waste what could bring warmth or save lives. If the Americans want it, they can take it. But they'll take it from men who still have dignity." Captain Dieter approached, whispering urgently. "Sir, that's surrender." "No," Weber said quietly. "It's awakening." At dusk, Allied scout jeeps appeared on the ridge. The Americans had arrived faster than anyone expected. The first shells fell short of the camp. Warning shots. "Raise the white flag," Weber ordered calmly. "No firing." No resistance. Within minutes, the flag went up, a piece of white canvas torn from an old tent fluttering over the camp. The soldiers held their breath. Then, out of the fog, a convoy rolled in. Olive-drab trucks with white stars painted on their sides. American infantry dismounted cautiously, rifles raised. At their head was a tall officer with a cigarette hanging from his lips. He stopped in front of Weber. "You the commanding officer here?" Weber nodded. "Colonel Hans Weber, German Army." The American's eyes flicked toward the fuel drums. "This all yours?" "We captured it from your supply lines," Weber admitted. "And we were ordered to destroy it." The American officer raised an eyebrow. "But you didn't." "No," Weber said. "I thought perhaps the world had burned enough." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the faint crackle of distant fire. Somewhere, another depot was going up in flames. Finally, the American extended his hand. "You just saved a lot of lives, Colonel." Weber hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, but there was a tremor in his voice when he said, "Maybe it's time we started saving instead of taking." That night, as American engineers moved in to secure the fuel and treat the wounded Germans, Weber sat alone by a dying fire. His uniform was still neat, but his insignia, the proud eagle of the Reich, had been removed. He watched the Americans share rations with his men. Cigarettes, chocolate, coffee. A young American handed a German soldier a bottle of Coca-Cola, and they both laughed, unable to understand each other's words but sharing a rare moment of peace. Weber took out his journal one last time and wrote, March 10th, 1945. Rhine Valley. We surrendered today, or perhaps we were liberated from our own delusion. The Americans did not gloat. They offered food. One gave me a drink, sweet, cold, and strange. I could not help but think how foolish we were to believe we could outlast them, not because of their weapons, but because of what they fight for, a life worth returning to. If this is defeat, then it is more merciful than our victory ever was. He closed the journal and looked up at the stars, faint, distant, eternal. For the first time, the night did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The year was 1946, and the war that had devoured an entire generation was finally over. Germany lay in ruins, its cities flattened, its people haunted, its soul fractured between guilt and survival. Colonel Hans Weber sat inside a small courtroom in Nuremberg, the faint echo of translators murmuring in different languages surrounding him. The banners of the Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, hung high above the tribunal bench. Their flags fluttered lightly in the draft of the hall, silent reminders that power had shifted permanently. Weber was not one of the men in the dock. He was here as a witness, a military officer called to provide testimony about the inner workings of the German army during the final months of the war. He wore a simple gray civilian suit now. The insignia, medals, and iron cross that once adorned his chest were gone. In their place sat a man who looked older than his years, thinner, quieter, but somehow more human. When his name was called, Weber rose slowly and took the stand. The courtroom fell silent. The Allied prosecutor, an American colonel named Robert Ellison, adjusted his glasses and opened a file. Colonel Hans Weber, he began in a calm but firm tone. You were stationed near the Rhine in early 1945, correct? Yes, Weber replied, his German accent precise, subdued. My regiment was part of the remnants of the 15th Panzer Division. Ellison nodded. And during that time, your unit captured approximately 50,000 gallons of American fuel? That is correct. The prosecutor stepped closer. Your orders were to destroy it, were they not? Weber's eyes flicked down. Yes, but you didn't. A pause. No, I didn't. The murmur in the courtroom swelled briefly before Ellison raised a hand. Colonel Weber, can you tell the tribunal why you disobeyed those orders? Weber took a slow breath. He could feel the eyes of the judges, the journalists, and the translators fixed on him. For a moment, he remembered the crackle of fire, the smell of diesel, and the frightened faces of his men under the gray sky. When I received that order, he said slowly, I realized that obeying it would serve no purpose other than destruction. The war was already lost. Our army was starving, retreating, broken. Burning that fuel would not change the outcome. It would only deny others, soldiers, civilians, the means to survive. Ellison leaned in slightly. You chose to surrender the fuel instead of destroying it. Yes. Did you understand that doing so would be considered treason by your command? Weber gave a faint, tired smile. At that point, Colonel, the only thing more treasonous than disobedience was obedience itself. A low ripple of reaction passed through the audience. Ellison glanced at his notes. You've written in your journal, which has been entered into evidence, that you saw in the Americans something you called the civilization of abundance. What did you mean by that? Weber's eyes softened as he spoke. It was not about their weapons. It was about their spirit. Even in war, they preserved the essence of life. They shared food, made music, made ice cream. They carried comfort with them, as if to remind themselves what they were fighting for. We, on the other hand, had forgotten that completely. We were fighting for a ghost, for the illusion of glory that had long since turned to ash. Ellison was quiet for a moment. And do you believe now that Germany's cause was just? Weber's reply came immediately. No. It was poisoned from the start. I believed in my country. Not in tyranny. But by the time I realized the difference, it was already too late. The room went silent. The judges exchanged glances, scribbling notes. Finally, Ellison nodded. No further questions. After his testimony, Weber sat outside the courthouse, watching the slow movement of clouds across a pale sky. The city of Nuremberg was a skeleton, stone buildings torn open, streets littered with rubble. He felt no relief, no pride, only a heavy sense of mourning. A group of American soldiers passed by, laughing quietly among themselves. They carried crates of supplies, their uniforms clean, their faces alive with youth. Weber couldn't help but think of the first time he saw them up close, back at the fuel camp, sharing cigarettes with his men. Colonel Weber? He turned. It was Colonel Ellison, the American prosecutor. He was off duty now, coat unbuttoned, a cigarette in his hand. I just wanted to say, Ellison began, your testimony, it meant something. Not all of your countrymen are admitting what you did. Weber nodded slowly. Perhaps they still hope to find pride in the ruins. Ellison exhaled a stream of smoke, studying the German officer. Do you regret surrendering the fuel? No, Weber said firmly. I regret that it took me so long to understand what honor really meant. The American smiled faintly. For what it's worth, that act probably saved lives, both ours and yours. You gave us a victory that didn't need more blood. Weber looked out toward the horizon. And yet, all I can think of are the faces of the men who didn't live to see that day. Ellison nodded. War doesn't end when the guns go silent, Colonel. It just changes shape. He offered Weber a cigarette. For a moment, the German hesitated, then took it. The two men sat quietly on the courthouse steps, two soldiers from opposite sides, united by the same exhaustion. Later that night, in a small rented room overlooking the devastated streets, Weber opened his journal one last time. The ink bled faintly into the paper. The handwriting of a man trying to make peace with ghosts. May 3rd, 1946, Nuremberg. The war has ended, but its weight has not lifted. I stood today in a hall built for judgment and realized that truth is the only victory left to us. I once thought duty was the highest virtue. Now I see that conscience is greater still. They call men like me survivors. But survival is not redemption. It is a burden to tell what happened and why. If history remembers me at all, let it not be as a soldier who obeyed, but as one who finally refused. He closed the journal and placed it carefully inside a small wooden box. Outside, the city lights flickered uncertainly, like the faint glow of a world learning how to begin again. In the distance, a military truck rumbled past, not German this time, but American. Its rear gate was painted with the simple white words, "Fuel for Rebuilding." Weber watched it disappear into the mist, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He whispered to the empty room, "They made ice again." And for the first time in years, Colonel Hans Weber felt the quiet peace of a man who had finally surrendered, not to an army, but to truth itself. The war was over, at least on paper. Germany had surrendered, Hitler was dead, and Europe was trying to breathe again. But for many soldiers, the real battle had just begun. Leo sat by a broken wall in Berlin, staring into the smoke-filled sky. He wasn't the same man anymore. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. His heart raced at the sound of every distant bang. The once confident soldier who had fought through Normandy and Ardennes was now haunted, not by the enemy, but by his memories. Every night, he saw faces. The boy who surrendered in Normandy and was shot anyway. The German medic who risked his life to save an American. The friend who didn't make it out of the forest. They all came back in his dreams, whispering, crying, accusing. Across the Atlantic, American soldiers returning home were welcomed as heroes. There were parades, medals, and smiling crowds. But behind every cheer was a shadow. Many couldn't sleep, couldn't work, couldn't live without remembering the screams and gunfire. And in Germany, the ghosts took a different form. Bombed cities, starving children, mothers searching for sons who would never return. The proud soldiers of the Third Reich were now reduced to rubble, both in spirit and in home. In one corner of a ruined Berlin street, Leo met a young German boy, no older than 10, trying to drag a sack of bread. He looked exactly like the boys Leo had seen running through towns during the war, the ones holding rifles too big for their arms. Leo offered him chocolate, one of the last pieces he had. The boy hesitated, then took it silently. They sat together on the curb, saying nothing. It was in that moment Leo realized there were no winners in this war, only survivors. The radio played in the background, a voice announcing the beginning of the Nuremberg trials. Justice, they called it. But, to the men who lived it, justice was too abstract a word. It couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't erase the smell of burning cities, couldn't silence the guilt. Months later, when Leo returned home, he passed through a Coca-Cola factory. Workers cheered, waving flags. Someone handed him a bottle, ice cold, sweet, familiar. He smiled faintly but didn't drink it. To him, Coca-Cola wasn't a symbol of victory anymore. It was a reminder of how absurd war could be. Men killing each other while drinking the same soda, dreaming of the same peace. That night, Leo sat by his window, watching the rain slide down the glass. He took out his old war photo, his squad, smiling, alive, unaware of what was coming. He whispered quietly, "We made it home, boys, but not all of us." And then he did something he hadn't done in years. He cried, not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as a man who had finally understood that war never truly ends. Berlin was no longer the city it once was. The Reichstag lay in ruins, streets were split open like scars, and yet, in every corner, new life began to stir. Men in rags cleared rubble, women planted vegetables where bombs had fallen, and children played among the ruins as if they had never known anything else. Leo walked those streets with a strange heaviness in his chest. The war had ended, but the air was still thick with fear. Soviet tanks rolled through the eastern half of the city, while American jeeps patrolled the west. Former allies now eyed each other like wolves circling the same carcass. The Cold War had begun, not with gunfire, but with suspicion. Leo had been reassigned to the U.S. Army's rebuilding division in West Berlin. His mission, to help rebuild communication lines and assist displaced families. But his true mission was something deeper, to rebuild himself. Every day he passed the same boy he had once given chocolate to. The boy's name was Eric, and now he helped Leo distribute food to survivors. Despite their language barrier, they became friends. Leo taught him English words like hope and future. Eric taught Leo a German word he'd never forget: Wiederaufbau, rebuilding. One afternoon, as they worked near the remains of a bombed-out apartment, Leo overheard Soviet soldiers arguing with local Germans. The tension was thick. One Soviet pointed at the American flag on Leo's shoulder and sneered, "Your democracy feeds them lies." "We feed them bread." Leo didn't respond. He'd seen enough death to know that ideologies were just new uniforms for old wars. But something stirred in him that day. The realization that peace was fragile, and the world was already dividing again. By winter, Berlin had changed. Coca-Cola signs reappeared. American trucks roamed the city carrying supplies, and, oddly, ice cream machines. The same luxuries that had stunned German soldiers during the war were now part of the rebuilding process. To the locals, it was surreal. The same soldiers who once fought them were now handing out sweet treats and laughter. Eric licked his first ice cream cone in silence. Then, smiling faintly, he said, "Maybe America wins because it knows how to make people happy." Leo laughed. "Maybe we both win if we learn from each other." But beneath the laughter, dark clouds gathered. Reports came in of spies, defectors, and walls being planned. The Berlin that Leo was helping to rebuild would soon be split in two, by ideology, by fear, by concrete. That night, Leo wrote a letter home. "We fought a war to end all wars, but now I see another one starting without bullets. The world is rebuilding walls faster than it builds bridges. Still, I'll keep working. One brick, one heart, one child at a time." As he sealed the envelope, he looked outside at the faint glow of lights returning to the city. Amidst ruins, life had found a way. Leo whispered softly, "If there's any victory worth having, it's this: learning to live again." And as snow began to fall over Berlin, covering the scars of war in white, the world stood at the edge of a new chapter, one where peace would be tested and history would decide whether humanity had truly learned from its ashes.